Well, welcome to another episode of Mortgage Minute. My name is Jeff Harrison, and there's a lot going on today. And I think the big question that probably goes on in a lot of our minds is this good news or bad news? We don't know. I guess it depends on which corner of the street you're on. I remember an example where there was an accident at a very busy intersection, and the police officer went to each corner and asked the question what that person saw, and each one of those people saw a different situation. But the accident happened, so now the pressure is on the police officer to make a decision. Hey, who's responsible here? What should we do? Well, we have our own police officer who sees all four corners, and that is Art Alvarez. Let's bring him in today. Hey, Art, how you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well, Jeff. How are you?
Good. You are our mortgage police officer.
Well, it's funny you say that because most of my adult life, I've been accused of looking like I'm a cop. Countless times I've been asked, "Are you a cop? Or are you a police officer?" I'm like, "No, never have been."
Would you like me to be?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Well, so a lot's going on. The Feds met yesterday, and I know you're going to get into that, but it's like, the whole thing is white a good color, bad color? I guess it just depends. Is black a good color, bad color? It depends on how you interpret the data. And I can't wait to see how you're going to dive into that and help us see kind of, if you will, around the corner and see what's going on.
Yeah, exactly what we're going to try to do, both with regard to the financial markets, as well as a little bit later, we're going to talk about home prices and, talk about which way to look at that. Boy, that's a confusing subject.
I'm excited about that too. Hey, those of you joining us live, keep in mind, this is a live show, meaning you can put questions in the comments, whether you're on Facebook or YouTube. I'll be in the background. I'll be looking at those. I'll feed those to Art. He'll answer them as we're on the show, because here's the thing, mortgage work. If you have questions, he has answers, and they're on the house. So you're watching it afterwards. You have questions, please put them in the comments, also on Facebook and YouTube. And Art is really good about going back and checking those and making sure you have an answer. With that, Art, I'm out of here. I'm going to turn over to you. Have a great show.
Thanks, Jeff. Welcome, everyone, to this week's Mortgage Minute, coming to you from beautiful Palm Springs, California. Although keep in mind, I arrange loans all through the state. We got a little bit of chilly weather today. I almost had to bring in my sweater. We're only 112 according to my phone. So a little bit down from earlier in the week when we were in the one teens. So it's been an interesting week. Of course, this week in the financial markets, it's all about the Fed. They had their 2-day meetings on Tuesday and Wednesday. So I want to get into that and give you, first of all, as we always do, the mortgage rate update. In fact, we used to pass out flyers to realtors, and we called it the interest rate reporter. Well, here's our rate grid. What you're going to see on this rate grid is, as I said last week, not really much of a change. We're still in the sixes. In fact, I would argue, it's a 6% market, somewhere in the sixes. That seems to be the common theme throughout almost every loan product. And it's interesting how the bond market kind of fared this week. Jeff's going to pull up a chart of the 5-day bond yield, 10-year bond yield. And you can see how it was relatively stable most all of this week, going back to last Friday up until today. And then you see that big run up today where we're kissing 4% on the yield. So what's going on with that? Well, of course, interestingly, yesterday was the Fed meeting, the conclusion of the 2-day Fed meetings, and they did announce, as expected, another 0.25% increase in the Fed funds rate. So as a result, you would have thought that probably had something to do with that upward climb in the bond yield that you just saw in the previous chart. Well, not exactly. When the announcement was first made mid-morning Pacific time, or actually late morning, about 11:15 in the morning Pacific time, the initial reaction in the bond markets is bond yields improved. The 10-year actually dropped from 390 to about 385. And I've seen a pretty consistent pattern in that regard. Usually what I tend to see is as we approach the next Fed meeting, 10-year bond yields tend to trend upward. And then if the announcement of their decision is as the market expected, oftentimes the initial reaction is not for the 10-year bond yield to go up, but actually to drop. Of course, mortgage rates tend to follow in that same direction. So this run-up that you saw in the previous chart is really more about today. And today's news, the primary news was GDP. GDP for the second quarter was announced today. It was forecast to be an increase of 1.5%. versus 2% in the first quarter. Well, it turns out it was up 2.4. So it was actually an increase and well above forecast. Of course, that implies that the economy is moving along pretty well and growing, and so therefore getting stronger. And then the other couple of things that were announced today that's not on our slide is unemployment claims, 221,000. That's actually a little bit lower than the previous month. And that, again, is been on the low side, which suggests the job market's pretty strong. Durable goods orders, which was forecast to be 1.3% increase, actually 4.7. So that data, along with GDP, that's what's really driving the 10-year bond yield up a little bit today. So then what's going to be happening the rest of the week? Well, about the only remaining economic data point to be released is tomorrow. And that is the PCE, or the Personal Consumption Expenditures Index. I've talked about this before. What this measures is the cost of living for households, and it uses a weighted average. And in other words, the cost of living that's measured is going to take into account different expenditures and how they're weighted in terms of a family budget. For example, gasoline is going to, of course, carry more weight than tomatoes. And this is a survey that is one where they get the data from businesses, not consumers. In other words, they survey businesses to find out what's going on with the various products and services in terms of prices that they're going to be selling to those consumers. This index is actually the preferred index by the Fed. They like this index the best in terms of their own, evaluation of where we're at in terms of inflation. And so this will be an important number for tomorrow. The forecast is 1.5% versus 4.2 in the first quarter. So the forecast is a pretty strong, decrease in the inflation number, and we'll have to see if that happens. If it does, if it's anywhere close to forecast, I would argue that that's probably going to be good news for bond yields. You may start to see that 10-year bond yield, turn around and come back down and erase what we're seeing today. And again, where we're seeing today is still a little bit lower, that 4% or so, than where we were at right after the July 4 holiday, when it spiked up to almost 410. So in that regard, I continue to say, don't panic. We're still pretty stable in interest rates overall. We're definitely a 6% plus mortgage market, 6.5, 6.75, depending on the type of transaction, credit scores, purpose of the loan, et cetera. So in that regard, I think things are pretty stable, and it's probably appropriate that we all just, as hard as it may seem, just begin to grasp that this is where we're at. This is where rates are going to be, at least in the short run. I don't really see them spiking up too much higher than where we're at right now. Okay, with that, I want to get into something that Jeff was alluding to earlier when he was talking about, seeing an accident and people on all four corners see it differently. So the next subject I want to talk about is home prices. And as I've told you before, I try to pay attention to the news feed as it relates to financial markets, real estate, and so forth. And this week, I found a couple of things very interesting to me, and I wanted to go over them. And as I put here, home prices, are they going up? Are they going down? Well, what you're going to learn here is it depends on who you ask. Business Insider, of course, a business publication, actually had two different articles with predictions of home prices, where they're going to go from here. And the first one was featuring a Yale economist that many of you may have heard of before. His name's Robert Shiller. And he is the creator of an index along with another gentleman. It's called the Case-Shiller Home Price Index. And it's interesting. In this article, Shiller is suggesting that the decades-old rally in home prices, that means increase in home prices, is coming to an end. And pretty interesting to hear him say that. So I was curious to see the details of what his argument was. And now in his index, it has shown a steady increase in home prices since 2012. And so as a consequence, since then, it peaked in June of 22, and then down at the end of 22, and then starting to go back up in January of 23. However, he's now suggesting that that uptick is going to subside and not continue. And he had a very interesting argument that, frankly, I've mentioned before. I have a piece of paper that says I know something about economics, and he had an interesting input or judgment on this. His argument is that rate hikes added to home buyer demand. In other words, it brought out home buyers. The rate hikes brought out home buyers, and that's what drove up home prices over the spring period of 23. And he referred to it as unusual behavior, and made it because folks were trying to, consumers were trying to make sense of what the Fed was doing. And so as a consequence, he's thinking that their confusion on that, and with rates going up, that brought buyers out, increased the demand, and that's what drove home prices up. But his argument now is that if we are going to see a moderation of increases in the Fed funds rate that the Fed's been doing, and we start to see that stop and maybe even start to go down, his argument is that the lower rates is going to increase housing supply. Well, that's true. That's just basic economics, right? But I think the question that may be getting missed here is, and I'm hesitant to say Mr. Schiller is maybe not quite looking at this right, but my argument would be yes, future rate cuts likely will bring in more housing inventory. All those homeowners who are locked in at very low rates and have a lot of equity, maybe want to buy another home. Future rate cuts should prompt some of them, many of them, to put their home in the market. But I would argue that as a consequence of that, even though there'll be greater supply, it's not going to diminish prices, because there's so much pent-up demand that even with an increase of inventory, that's not going to outpace demand. There is very large amount of pent-up demand for home buyers. We have a huge shortage in the housing stock in this country. So my argument would be, even with a Fed rate cut, and you've heard me say this already, yes, it's going to bring in more inventory, but there's so much buyer demand that's going to overwhelm even the increased inventory that we're likely to see. And it was interesting, the article concluded that Schiller's take does run counter that most observers on Wall Street. So that's pretty interesting. He's well respected. He was, of course, he's attributed to having predicted the crash of '08. And so he has a pretty good track record. So I found it very interesting, his prediction. And as you can tell, I'm not quite sure I'm convinced. So that moves us over to the other opinion on this, the guy on the other corner, to use Jeff's analogy. And this is coming from, and again, this was also in Business Insider. This is coming from the CEO of the MBS Highway, a gentleman his name's Barry Habib. Now, Barry is interesting. He actually has a mortgage background. He was in the mortgage industry, originating loans and being involved on that end way back in the late 80s, now almost as long as I've been. And he has since become somewhat of an expert. He's got this company that's used by the mortgage industry. He's been on various business channels. He's a highly touted speaker about financial matters, real estate, the mortgage market, and home prices. And in this article, again, running companion to the Schiller article, his prediction is that we're going to see home prices rise nearly 6% in 2023. And then he further predicts that in the next 1 to 3 years after that, home prices are going to go up about 3 to 7%. So that's pretty strong prediction. And again, quite contrary to what Schiller predicted, as I just mentioned. So what's going on there? Well, of course, Habib does believe that that falling inflation is going to create a recession-like slowdown. Well, of course, as we just talked about with our rate update, some of the indicators are pretty strong about the economy. So we'll see if the recession is still going to happen. In fact, after the Fed meeting, they essentially declared they don't see a recession coming now at all, which is, again, part of the reason the bond yields moved up a little bit today. So in this case, Habib seems to disagree with that, thinks that we are going to be seeing more in falling inflation numbers, which I do agree with that, but that we're also headed towards some sort of recession-like slowdown. And of course, his suggestion is if that occurs, that's going to cause the Fed to lower rates, and that's going to help, it's going to bring in more supply, but again, it's going to help in terms of demand from home buyers. And one of the things that we've seen is, despite the economy, there is a lot of income out there. There is a lot of income that does help with affordability, even at these rate levels. And so I think that's going to help, prevent the kind of home price reduction that Schiller's predicting. Inventory is very tight, and as Habib would say, rents are no picnic. the cost of rent these days is almost as high or worse than, even mortgages at 6%. So for all those reasons, Habib is on the side that suggests that even with the reduction in rates, the increased demand, it's going to outpace the increased supply that's going to occur when those rates drop. And that's actually going to prop up or support prices and cause those increases that he's predicting over the next couple of years. So given the two scenarios, given the two experts, and it's interesting, again, Barry Habib doesn't have he doesn't have an econ degree. He doesn't have that kind of background, but yet call him the guy on the street that's lived there, been there, done that, knows what's going on intimately in terms of the mortgage market. I'd have to tend to agree that even though I've got an econ degree in my closet somewhere, I'm going to have to differ with our economist, Mr. Schiller. I think Barry Habib's a little bit more on the mark as to where home prices are going from here. So keep that in mind. If you're still on this the fence about selling your home, I think you should rethink that. If you're wanting to buy and you're kind of hesitant, looking for rates to drop substantially, not sure you should wait. I think you're better off, if you can afford the payment, go after a purchase now. Always look to refi in the next couple of years. So there you go. It depends on who you ask. Both opinions have strong arguments, but I'm going to put my money on Mr. Habib. I think home prices are going to firm up and increase further. Again, not hugely. They're not going to run up in substantial amounts, but I think somewhere in the 3 to 4 to 6% range is really historically pretty normal. So I think that's good news. Okay, with that, I want to go on to another subject, a little bit of a product focus, mortgage product focus. And, you're going to find this interesting, but I'm going back to wanting to talk about HELOCs. And again, what is a HELOC? It's a home equity line of credit. And I'm calling this segment HELOCs for Dummies. And the reason I'm doing that is because, I got a couple of inquiries just this week from folks considering a HELOC, but they had a lot of questions. And what it got me to realize is that despite the fact that HELOCs are very popular, they're probably the primary go-to choice for pulling equity out of your home without refinancing your first mortgage. But yet, despite all that, you would think that the product is well known, everyone understands how they work. And what I find quite often is that it's not really the case. The product is considered a little bit complex, and it can be hard for some consumers to understand how that works. So I want to review that with you here real quick, because it's really a lot simpler than you might think. The first thing to understand about a HELOC, it's a second mortgage. Many times I've had conversations with homeowners who are looking to get a HELOC, and they'll make a comment to me something along the lines of, I'm interested in a HELOC. I don't want a second mortgage. I just want to get a HELOC. And of course, I have to point out to them, no, understand that a HELOC is a second mortgage. It's or what we more technically would call a junior mortgage lien. So when you get a HELOC, when you get this line of credit, it is secured by your home as an additional mortgage lien. And by the way, HELOCs usually are going to be in second position. In some cases, a HELOC can be arranged for someone who owns a home free and clear. And it can be a first lien, like a first mortgage in position on that home. So HELOC can be in first position. Most commonly, they are a second mortgage in second position behind the first mortgage that was recorded earlier. And in some cases, you can get HELOCs in third position. Yes, believe it or not, it is possible with some lenders to get a HELOC in third position behind maybe an existing first mortgage, an existing second that is a HELOC, and then get an additional HELOC. So that is possible, believe it or not. But in terms of HELOCs, what I tell people, the simplest way to understand how they work, at least mostly in part, is think of a HELOC as it's a credit card attached to your home. In fact, I was going to call this segment, what? HELOC? Isn't that like getting a credit card to pay off your credit cards? But the point of it is that a HELOC, in terms of how it works, it's very much like a credit card, but it's secured by your home, which, by the way, that's part of the reason those HELOCs are going to have a rate much, much lower than your credit cards. Because remember, credit cards are unsecured loans. A HELOC is secured by your home. That creates more safety for the lender. That helps bring that yield down on a HELOC versus having a credit card loan that's not secured by real property. Now, the other thing about a HELOC, it's a variable rate loan. Now, that spooks people. yes, the loan adjusts. So it's like an ARM loan, an adjustable rate mortgage on your, if you have a first mortgage. So a variable rate loan is what a HELOC is. So that does spook people. And then further, what really is confusing is, given that it's a variable rate loan, it does not adjust on a scheduled basis. A first mortgage adjustable rate loan or variable rate loan is going to typically have a fixed rate and payment for 3 years or 5 years or 7 years or 10 years. And then after that fixed period, it's going to adjust once a year or maybe once every 6 months. HELOCs don't work that way. A HELOC will adjust, but you don't know when. Why? Because the HELOC only adjusts when the Fed, like yesterday, changes up or down the Fed funds rate. So as a consequence, you don't have the peace of mind of knowing what the future schedule of adjustments are going to be. You're completely at the mercy of the Fed and what their decisions they make each time they have a meeting, which is generally about once a month, not quite, but pretty close to that. So just understand it is a variable rate loan, but it does not adjust on a scheduled basis. It only adjusts when the Fed changes the Fed funds rate, and the Fed funds rate does directly correlate to a HELOC. Now, in terms of adjustments, a HELOC does not have any caps on the adjustments, the individual adjustments. It only has a life cap of 18%. So again, each time the Fed changes the Fed funds rate, your HELOC rate is going to adjust immediately by the same amount. There is no cap on that increase. So if the Fed decided to raise the Fed funds rate 1% all in one fell swoop, your HELOC would go up by that amount at the exact, immediately. So just keep that in mind. Although, frankly, that kind of increase, that large is extremely rare. In fact, I'm not even sure I can recall it ever happening. So just be aware of that. And of course, you do have the 18% life cap. Now a HELOC rate is set by an index. It's a interest rate that the loan is based on. In this case, the most common index for a HELOC is the prime rate. It used to be called the commercial bank prime rate. Now it's more technically called the weekly average prime rate. It's basically the prime rate that banks offer to their prime customers. So prime directly correlates to the Fed funds rate. Whenever the Fed funds rate changes, prime changes. So most HELOCs are tied to prime, and then there'll be a margin over that prime index number. Now, right now, as a result of what the Fed did yesterday, the prime rate's at 8.5. Most HELOCs will have a margin ranging from anywhere from 0.74 to a couple of percent, or even higher if you have lower credit scores and maybe a higher loan to value. So effectively, that means that HELOCs right now are running somewhere in the range of, say, 9.5 to 11% or more, again, depending on your credit score and loan to value. So that's how the rate is set. You've got the prime rate, you've got your margin. Whenever the prime rate changes because of the Fed changing the Fed funds rate, that's when your HELOC rate's going to change. And by the way, that's exactly how credit cards work. Credit cards are typically tied to prime. And so they have a margin over prime too, but the margin's much higher because it's an unsecured loan, not secured by your home. Now, once you get the loan, there are 2 periods in your HELOC. The first period is called the draw period. That draw period typically is going to be for 10 years. During that 10-year period, it's important to know, what does that mean? Well, during the 10-year period, the first feature is the minimum payment required on the loan every month is interest only. You don't have to pay any principal. The minimum payment is only interest. And by the way, it's based on the outstanding balance. That's a key thing to understand, a key distinction over, say, a first mortgage. Your minimum monthly payment is going to be based on the outstanding balance at every month, and the minimum that you have to pay is only interest. You do not have to pay any principal. Now, if you choose to pay down the principal, which I recommend you do, that drops the balance. As that drops the balance, then your required payment the following month goes down immediately. Why? Because again, that monthly payment is based on the outstanding balance. So it's important, it's to your benefit to pay extra than that interest only minimum, get that balance down, because that's going to reduce your required payment the next month. Plus it frees up some of the credit line to use again. And by the way, if you take it all the way to the extreme, you draw out a bunch of money, you pay it down quickly, maybe you pay it back down to zero, there's no payment. Why? No balance, no monthly payment. Again, just like a credit card. You pay off your creded card. That doesn't mean your account's closed unless you ask for it to be closed. That just means you got no balance and you don't have to make a payment because there's no balance to pay a payment from. HELOC works exactly the same way. Now, what happens after 10 years? Well, after 10 years, we then have what's called the repayment period. Now, the repayment period in most cases is going to be a period of an additional 20 years. So that in reality, this is a 30-year loan. You've got your 10-year draw period, then your 20-year repayment period. So what happens at that beginning of that 20-year period, which starts the first month, January of January in the 11th year, or whatever month you got the loan, starting the 11th year, what happens? Well, the interest-only payment feature goes away. You can no longer make interest-only payments. You can no longer draw against the HELOC if you have some unused credit available. You can't draw against that anymore. It's closed. So then what they do is they take that remaining balance and they amortize that over an additional 20 years so that it's paid off in full at that 20-year, at the end of that 20-year period. So if you've got that HELOC maxed out, when you hit that year 11, again, you can't make interest only anymore. You can't draw against it. Of course, you've already maxed it out anyway, so there's no available credit to draw from. Again, just like a credit card. And you've got to take that fully drawn out balance, amortize it over 20 years to pay it off. That's going to mean a pretty healthy jump in your required monthly payment. So that's another incentive to try to pay that balance down before you get to that start of the 11th year, where that repayment period can be pretty challenging maybe in your monthly payment if it's fully maxed out. So hopefully that'll eliminate some of the mystery and confusion and complexity of how a HELOC works. Again, it's pretty simple when you think about it. Think in terms of a credit card. It works very much in the same way, but again, it's secured by your home as a junior lien, most likely a second mortgage. Okay, so hopefully that helps. And again, with HELOCs, I'll tell you, one thing I'll suggest is it's a great opportunity to pay off revolving credit card debt. I would say that's probably, if not the number one, probably the number two reason people get HELOCs. Because after all, even though it operates like a credit card, you can still have an opportunity to get rid of that 22 to 25% credit card debt, get your rate down hopefully to somewhere in the 9.5, 10, 11% range. That's a huge reduction in interest cost. But I always counsel homeowners, you got to kind of change your behavior if you're going to do the HELOC to get rid of that revolving debt. You want to change your behavior to avoid running up that revolving debt again, because then you can end up using all that equity, having paid it off the first time, and then be back in the same boat. And so you want to kind of change look at your spending habits, figure out how to avoid that large amount of revolving debt in the future. Understand your HELOC is sort of the same type of instrument, and that there is some incentive to pay it down. And then to the extent you have unused credit, that's there for a rainy day if you need cash in an emergency. So keep that in mind when you're contemplating HELOC. It's still a great product. I encourage anybody who's kind of has a heavy situation in terms of revolving credit card debt, take a look at this as an option to get that interest cost down. With that, I want to go ahead and move into our closing question from last week. It's an interesting one. I think you might find it having been a little bit of a challenge. Let me read it to you again. Due to unfortunate circumstances, a prospective buyer had a previous foreclosure on an investment property only 15 months ago. The buyer is now looking to purchase a second home in the Palm Springs area, listed for $1.5 million, with a 20% down payment. This period since the previous foreclosure is too short to meet minimum what's called adverse event wait periods for most loan programs. Therefore, will this prospective buyer be able to obtain institutional financing for this desired purchase? Well, believe it or not, the answer is yes. We do have a program that would meet this scenario. You may have recalled last week I talked about the community mortgage program. This is a mortgage that we deliver to a lender who is a is a community development financial institution. Again, a community development financial institution certified by the U.S. Treasury Department. This program actually allows only 1 year seasoning since a previous foreclosure. Now, most any other conforming program, they're not even close to that. Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac requires 7 years. FHA, VA is the shorter period, but it's still much longer than 1 year. So this program, only 1 year seasoning required from a previous foreclosure. So that's really huge, particularly in this example. What I was trying to portray is someone who maybe had a rental property and they lost that, but they were okay on their primary home, et cetera. They still, have plenty of liquid assets and they want to purchase a home. This is a program that works great for this kind of scenario. It's available for both primary and second homes. Unfortunately, we can't do it on rental property. And again, remember the primary feature of this program. No employment is documented. You don't disclose your employment. You don't disclose or document your income. There is no debt ratio calculated at all. It is a true no ratio loan. So you're qualified essentially based on your loan amount and the loan to value that results for your transaction, your credit score, and documenting your assets. And the good thing about that is we only have to document and source your assets for 30 days. Most conforming loans, jumbo loans, we have to source and document assets. Assets, by the way, means your money in the bank, checking, savings, stock, mutual funds, retirement accounts. Assets only have to be seasoned for 30 days. We don't have to go back 60 or more like most other programs do. So keep this program in mind. If you know anyone who's had the unfortunate experience of having a recent foreclosure, at least over a year old, but not less than that, they have cash, they want to buy a home, but they're running out of options and obstacles in getting the financing. This is a great program. I would welcome you to give us a call. Be happy to give somebody some numbers to see how it works. So just another great feature of this community mortgage program. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and finish up with our closing question for next week. And this was actually a question I get fairly often and was triggered by the fact that I had someone, a current client I'm working with, ask me the question. So here it is. What are the benefits of setting up a biweekly payment schedule for a new mortgage? And this was asked by someone I'm arranging a mortgage for, and they wanted to know how to set that up after they close their transaction. So again, what are the benefits of setting up a biweekly payment schedule for your new mortgage? And is it possible to achieve the same result without setting up biweekly payments with your loan servicer? So tune in next week. I'll have an answer for you on that. And guess what? It'll be on the house. Jeff, back to you.
Art, great information. I tell you what, that's that whole thing about who knows what happened, who caused the accident in the intersection. I'm not sure I still know, but I kind of like the idea of there's some boots on the ground. They've gone through this before, like Barry Habib and you, quite frankly, and have a little bit more insight into that. And it's not just I'm not much of a theorist. I like people who said, I got my hands dirty, a little grease under my nails. This is how it really works. And so I like that.
I think you're right. I mean, frankly, that's why, even though I should, given my educational background, I should be sticking up for the expert, well-known, famous economist. But what struck me a little bit about it, and of course, I have to take into account too, it may have something to do with how the article's written. I mean, you have to consider, especially when you're quoting experts, maybe the person who wrote this article about Shiller's take on the markets, maybe he didn't quite have it right and didn't really communicate what Shiller was thinking. But it just seemed odd to me because it was almost like Shiller was ignoring the demand side of the equation. I mean, home prices, did dip a little bit the second half of last year, but they firmed up at the beginning of this year. They appear to be continuing to do so. And even if we get a lot more inventory, so we get back to normal when rates do fall, whenever that happens, I think that their pent-up demand is so huge, it's going to overrun any increase in inventory. And that, as a result, is, I think, going to prop up home prices. And it's pretty apparent that's where Habib's coming from. And again, not because he learned it with a piece of paper that says he knows everything about econ. I think it's just he's lived in that world, pretty much for 40 years. He's not in the front lines like I am, but he used to be, was very successful, owned mortgage companies, and now he just studies those markets. I try to do that too, but I'm still out there pounding the pavement, so to speak. And I think he just has a little more instinct about this that's going to prove to be correct.
Yeah, 100% agree. And I'll tell you what, today's show was very informative with many options. I love the idea of kind of that HELOC for dummies. There's a lot of things in there, even though I've had HELOCs before, that I forget about. That whole 10-year of interest only, and then going into a 20-year. It's like that's one of the questions people have is, well, how long is this HELOC good for? Well, 30 years in reality. So
Yep.
that's really a nice awareness. And I love the fact, Art, that you said, hey, just because you have this and you pay off your high interest credit cards, please consider adjusting your behavior so you don't get back in a situation so you have no recourse when you run up the credit cards again, and now your equity is gone. So I like that too.
Yeah, exactly right. Because that, and frankly, I saw a lot of that back before the crash of '08. Because part of the reason that the crash occurred, in addition to many borrowers, homeowners were not properly qualified for the mortgages they obtained, is we saw a situation with values running up so quickly before '08 that folks were coming back and refinancing their home for cash out, whether a first mortgage or a HELOC, multiple times in relatively short periods. And what you could see in those cases was some of those homeowners were not changing behavior. They'd run up debt, pull some equity out, pay it off. 6 months later, they're back, had run up debt again, pull more equity out of their home, pay it off, and eventually the equity's gone. So you got to understand the connection there. I think HELOC's great to pay off revolving debt, but you got to kind of have a talk with yourself, change your behavior, try to avoid that circumstance again, and then that HELOC will still be there for you as you pay it down for other uses. So
yeah, it sounds like it's a smart play to have that. Again, it's almost like saying, hey, I have this credit card that I can use in case.
right.
It doesn't mean I have to use it right away. I have to max it out. I have it there just in case. Because if somebody qualifies for a HELOC, it's not like they have to. There's probably some draw that has to happen, right?
Yeah, typically, at least with the HELOC programs we have, you have to draw at least 50,000 at the closing. In fact, that's the minimum line amount we can arrange. But you hit on a good point. Most every HELOC that I've done for the last year or so, in particular, a majority of those involved identifying how much was needed to accomplish whatever the objective was with the money. But I would say a majority of the time we ended up arranging a HELOC that was larger than that, so that once the homeowner realized, oh, I only need 50, but I can get 100. And now I feel more comfortable because I realize I'm not going to be paying based on 100 if I'm not using 100. If I'm only going to use 50, that's great. My payments are based on that, but at least I know I have that other 50 there for an emergency. And as a consequence, that's what most people ended up doing. So
I love that. Well, it sounds like people are calling from the show. They're ready to start arranging a HELOC with you. So I'm going to let you go. But before I let you go, hey, make sure to look at the numbers on the screen. It's 760-883-5700. That's how you can get Art at his office. Or always, what you heard him ringing there, the cell phone, that is the BAT line. That's the red hotline, 714-612-9035. And hey, if you just want to do some research, go to their website at mwloan.com. You can see there they have the rate grid of what's going on. And, of course, you can hit up Art via email at art@mwloan.com. Art, as always, thank you so much for the wealth of information. We really appreciate you staying on the corners and letting us know what's happening in the middle of the street.
Thanks, Jeff. I'll continue to do that. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week on the Mortgage Minute. Just remember, at Mortgage Works, we do have the answers, and they're on the house. Thank you. Take care.